Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to one more session of our Literatures and Cultures Colloquium, Spanish 8894. Today, we're going to hear a presentation by Professor Gabriela Polit-Dueñas from the University of Texas at Austin, but I'm going to pass the torch to both Ana del Sarto and Laura Podolsky, who will do the introduction for our speaker today. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Pedro. And let me share my screen. Everybody can see. Okay. It's a great pleasure, great pleasure to introduce and to welcome and introduce Gabriela Polit-Dueñas, professor at UT Austin of Latin American Literatures and Cultures. She will give a talk on Phenomenology of Affect, the Case of Marcela Turati. And I will just go around several of her publications. But before that, before introducing Professor Polit, let me and everyone thank the sponsors of today's talk. The Department of Spanish and Portuguese, CLAS, the Center of Latin American Studies, and the School of Communications. Without their support, this event would not have happened. Let me tell you a little bit about Gabi. Originally from Quito, Ecuador, is, as I said, professor of Latin American Literatures in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. She has a licenciatura in philosophy from Pontificia Universidad Católica del Ecuador, an MA on Poli-Science, on political sciences from the New School for Social Research, and a PhD in Latin American Literatures from New York University. She has published widely on two different lines, and let me move on here. Her academic books on Latin American cultural criticism discussed the representations of narco-trafficking and gender, masculinities in women's writings, focusing mainly on Colombia, Mexico, and Bolivia, on feminism, journalism, and the ethical conundrum of describing the suffering of others. And these are some of her books: Cosas de Hombres, Escritores y Caudillos en la Literatura Latinoamericana del Siglo XX, Narrating Narcos, Culiacán and Medellín, who has also the Spanish publications, Historias del Narco, Medellín y Culiacán, just published this year. And Unwanted Witnesses, Journalists in Conflict in Contemporary Latin America, from where a phenomenology of affect springs. And then also she has academic edited books, one co-edited book with María Elena Rueda, Meanings of Violence in Latin America, and another one on Crítica Literaria Ecuatoriana, but also her creative writing. And I think this is really interesting because she doesn't have just one genre. She has Historias de la Radio that were Historias de la Radio in New York when you were graduate students, right? Then Amsterdam Avenue, that is also dealing with the different problems of exile. And there are two forthcoming that I didn't know, that she let me know because I didn't know that she wrote poetry, Agujas, who will be published this year, and then Los Libros de Otros, a novel, which will be published next year. And so you have to tell us a little bit about that. Those were the images that I had in the books, and I cannot go over all the articles that she has published. She has published academic as well as non-academic articles in journals here in the US, in Spain, in Mexico, in Argentina. She was part of Amphibia with Cristian Alarcón. She probably might say something about that too. And she published in Colombia. Currently, she's coordinating, as she said, the Spanish Creative Writing Initiative at UT And in terms of her academic research, she's exploring fantasy and contemporary women's literature and film production, trying to unravel how drive and grief operate in the creation of art. Today, she will present, as I said at the beginning, a phenomenology of affects, the case of Marcela Turati, journalist from Mexico. And after her presentation, we'll have a chance for a Q&A section and discussion. So thank you so much, Gabby. Thank you for being here virtually with us today. And please, everybody, help me welcome in my dear friend with a virtual applause. So you can start whenever you want, Gabby.
That was way too generous. I'm going to believe that. What you said about me. I'm humbled. It is my pleasure to be here. I know so many people. I see you, Michelle, so good to see you. Laura, I haven't met you before, but so nice that you're here. I admire your work. And Anna and I have been together in this journey for over, you don't want to know how many years. We got here to this country the same year, so we know each other for a long, long time. Ignacio, it's so good to see you here. And all the rest, thank you for being here. I'm honored and it's a pleasure for me to be here. Well, I don't have a Zoom presentation. I am very scared of going to sharing the screen and messing it up. So you will have to bear with me. I'm not going to read my presentation. I'm going to deliver as a talk like this. I think that Zoom already puts us so much stress and it's draining us. So I will try to contact you. Well, I contact as much as possible through the screen. And so I have organize this presentation, taking into account that this is a colloquium. So I am going to present a chapter of a book. I know that some of you read this chapter, but some of you haven't. And so I will get to the chapter giving you a broad explanation of how I got to this particular research project and how the book came out. So this book was published in the former world. It seems to be decades ago, but it was only in the fall of 2019 when I presented. And so the first time that I presented the book, I promised myself that I was going to read the names of the journalists who had been killed after the publication of the book. For the ones of you who had seen it, it is dedicated to the journalists who had died in Latin America since 1992. And unfortunately, 3 whole pages are filled with the names of these journalists. And I stopped the count when the book went into production, which was 2018. So I'm not going to read the names of all the journalists killed, but I want to say that in the region, in 2019, 21 journalists were killed. In 2020, 27 journalists were killed. And in 2021, 23 journalists were killed. Mexico by far exceeds these numbers. I mean, most of these journalists, unfortunately, come from Mexico. And I want to honor all the journalists who have died. I'm going to tell you a little bit the story of how this book came out. And it's usually the case. And I want to make this presentation, I hope it to be intellectually stimulating and informative, but most of all, I want it to be useful for those of you who are, thinking about your research project, how you get there. So this is what I want to, this is how I frame the presentation of this chapter. I will go from broad to small. And so usually our books come from our previous books. That's how it goes. We go into a research and something stays lingering there, and then we follow that thread. And that is the case of this book. When I began thinking about the representation of narco-trafficking, that's back in 2005. And I ran into Luis Astorga in a meeting in Lhasa, and he said, you cannot go into this topic without visiting Culiacan. You cannot talk about the authors or the phenomenon of narco-trafficking if you don't go there. Today, it would seem like more usual, but back then, it wasn't not that usual that we literary people will go to visit and talk to the authors who we were going to read. It was even counterintuitive, because you're not supposed to be too close because you will lose objectivity. It might sound weird to you now into 2020, but it was that the case. But I took the challenge and I went to Culiacan, and I understood, and I interviewed writers, poets, theater people, journalists, painters, photographers. And so I understood that I needed to have tools to understand what I was going to see. And the category of field in Bourdieu was very helpful for me, because Bourdieu, he's a sociologist, and he uses field to understand how different fields interact and have tensions within each other, and how the actors in those fields act. And so, let's say in the field, the political field, how the actors then have tensions with the academic field or the journalistic field or the economic field, and that's how he sees how society works. It wasn't my intention to go all the way there, but the concept of the category of field enabled me to see that what I was looking at when I traveled to Culiacan and to Medellin was the cultural field, and to place the writers that I was interviewing within that field, to understand who were the immediate readers who legitimize their work, which ones were the institutions that gave them the legitimacy of writers, of cultural producers. So the concept of field was a very important tool for me to frame my argument in that book. And it is something that I carry on to this book. So among the people I interviewed Javier Valdez. And for those of you who know, Javier Valdez was a very prominent journalist who was killed in Culiacan one day in 2017, in the middle of the street at noon, 12 bullets. You know, it was horrible. But I was very close to Javier, and he helped me understand a lot of things that happen in the journalistic field. If you were a journalist from Culiacan writing on narco-trafficking, you really had to have a very wide sense of how to navigate this space. And so Javier will talk about the difficulties of it wasn't represented in an artistic way, because he was a journalist, he was a reportero, he was reporting on this. And so the challenges of reporting narco-trafficking, if you live in a city as Culiacan, which is the bedrock of the narcos, let's say, in Mexico, broadly speaking. But he also talked to me about the difficulties that he had as a cronista, more in an artsy way. He was a cronista. He wanted to write the more artistic, journalistic crónicas, these genre. And he had written 2 books that were sitting on some editor in Mexico City. So I understood that tension between Mexico City being this massive, centralistic place, and the difficulties of somebody coming from a state. And we can translate this in Argentina, being from the province, or Peru being from the province. It is such a big place, this cities occupied. So I saw two things there, right? The complexities of being a reportero and writing journalist because of the dangers you run, and also the difficulties of being somebody who wants to produce work and not being from Mexico City. And those things stay with me for a while. It was part of something that was in the back of my head. And because I began to write about narco trafficking and this representation of violence, I was invited to a couple of workshops organized by the then called Fundación Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano and now called Fundación Gao. I was co-coordinating workshops, writing workshops, and that enabled me to see the challenges that young writers face when writing about the others. And I'm talking about somebody worry about how do I write the story of Maria, who's a single mom who lives in the slums, and I want to honor Maria's story, and how I'm going to do that without reproducing all the stereotypes surrounded by in these repertoires of poverty, gender abuse. I mean, it is very difficult. And for me, coming from the literary field, used to criticize, criticizing in the way of, as a cultural critic, seeing how do you represent these things? It was a very humbling experience to see how they actually deal with these issues. And so I saw their work behind the scenes, so to speak. And I knew that that was something that I wanted to write about, because there was something there that as literary critics and as cultural critics, we tend not to see. And so because I was super engaged with the journalists, I invited Marcela Turati to come and present her book. And she came and presented her Fuego Cruzado at UT. And when Marcela presented that book here, she was trembling. Her eyes were lost somewhere. She couldn't make eye contact. She was shaking. She had a sense of unrest. And at the end of the presentation, she confessed that it was the first time that she presented the book without crying. And she also made us know that every time that she presented the book, she would apologize to the public for attending the presentation. As soon as Marcela switched topics and began to talk about the future project she had with activists, her whole body demeanor changed. She was engaged, she was relaxed, she was smiling. So I saw that there was this incredible trauma that she was carrying that was part of the narratives that I was reading. And it was like a blind spot, if you want. When we read the book, when we read these books, we just take the narratives. And so it was very strong, and there was something there that I really needed to understand. And so this is how somehow, I'm coming closer to tell you how these things became apparent to me. Of course, by this time, I was hanging out a lot with journalists, and I was learning a lot from them. For example, I learned that not anymore, because journalism as a field is one of the fields that is changing abruptly because of technology. And you have now, you choose your platform where to read news because you're tired of reading, official news. But let's say that 15, 20 years ago, a traditional newspaper, in a traditional newspaper, you have to cover politics, you have to cover economy, you have to cover sports, you have to cover yellow pages, you have to cover these different areas. And in a traditional newspaper, what happens is that politics was covered by men, and economy was covered by men, and yellow pages was covered by men, and sports was also a men's issue. But all the social was covered by women, because women were the ones covering poverty, education, hunger, all these social problems usually and traditionally had been in the field of journalistic production taken by women. So women had a lot of experience because of this division of labor within the field of production. Because of that, women have a lot of experience dealing with victims of social structures. So here you see how, without making any essential argument about gender, we are understanding how gender reproduces certain divisions of labor and how gender defines our work, for better or worse. In this case, when a violent event erupts, you have women being the ones, usually the ones who are closer to the victims because of a traditional work they have been doing for a long time, working with, poverty, hunger, and so I understood, because of these things, that women have a particular way of being listeners. They listen. That is the whole thing. So having all this informal or information, I knew that I had to understand where these narratives were coming from. And so if you open Fuego Cruzado, it is not a book that I would recommend to any of you. It is a very hard book. I don't know. If you're doing research, it is a book that you will have to read, but it's not a book that you read for pleasure at all. And many of us might say, oh no, it's so gruesome and the descriptions are so physical. Why does she get to go into so much detail? This is, a glamorization of violence. And I will put a stop. And I will tell you why I think that it is more complicated than that. But I also knew at this point that I was facing, when I was reading the book, not just the news or the long description of these violence events, but taking into account the place that the writer, in this case, Marcela, was occupying. I was dealing with a more complex thing. And I would say that I was dealing with a way of social suffering. And when I say this, I'm not following the anthropologist Binadas et al. Description of social suffering as product of social structures. I am talking about ways of suffering that has to do with daily life interactions and daily life emotional states of depression, anxiety, self-worthlessness, and how they are manifested in these narratives. And so I knew that I was dealing with that. And Sletkovich talks about the archives of feeling. It was something like that. It was a cultural trauma that I was dealing with. And the cultural trauma was not just the book and all those gruesome descriptions, but involved the writing. And I had to understand where that writing was coming from. And to understand that writing, or the origins of that writing, I had to understand the feelings or the emotions of the person who's delivering us those news, but also the material conditions in which these persons work. So going back to how I was going to be able to organize a book on this, how how can I put them together? I sort of knew that I wanted to write about this. How could I put these narratives in a certain order? Chronology wasn't working for me. How do you organize an analysis of this? So I'm going to read you something. I know reading is boring in Zoom, but it's a long quote, but it's a necessary quote for you to understand. Donna Di Cesare is a photojournalist. She has covered for over 20 something years El Salvador. So she knows El Salvador from the years of the war. So I'm talking more than 30 years. And she still works with Salvadorians and the Maras and the effects of that civil war. And she was the curator of a show in the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma at Columbia University. And she has a description that really was illuminating for me. And so she describes reporting on violence in 3 acts. She's talking about photography, but it could be applied to written journalism. The opening act, the moment of conflict, the crime scene, the anguish reaction, the struggle for survival in an unfolding natural disaster is first response image making. Such images convey commotion with potent dramatic content. Simply looking may raise our stress level, although not necessarily our understanding or empathy. And yet these images are primary material evidence, vital historical records or witness, both factual and interpretive. They may also become iconic. Act 2 is subtler. It is an attempt to draw out meaning in the aftermath, sometimes years after the traumatic event, and to document a process, grieving, a search for justice, a process of healing. How does one make absence presence in an image? Clearly, photographers documenting this dimension of trauma narrative might use conceptual strategies to help us visualize reflective thoughts and feelings, as well as material remnants. Perhaps most difficult to describe is Act 3, the realm of ambiguity most successfully explored in long-form works of art. The final act of the trauma narrative reserves its most penetrating focus for moral anguish and mental disintegration of the kind Dostoevsky contemplates in Crime and Punishment, or the damp and grisly November of the soul described by Ishmael in the opening Melville's great novel, Moby Dick. This is the realm of human experience for which answers are elusive, where victimizers may be also victims, where complex motivations resist any definite taxonomy, yet archetypal meaning continues to be sought. It is so well written. So Di Cesare gave me something that I didn't know, which is we tend to think about, let's say, violence as this thing, as if it were a monolithic thing. But there are moments, and it's not the same thing to write about the immediate moment after a horrible event that coming 2 years later or coming to it 10 years after. And that sense of timing gave me an idea of putting my narratives together. So I would say that Marcela Turati's Fuego Cruzado is somewhere between the first and the second act, because it's the first reaction. Marcela's book was one of the first ones that put, I mean, there were many short reportajes telling of what was going on. Many of them were hers. But in this book, it was the first book that was saying the war on drugs is killing innocent people in rural areas and urban areas, and they are poor. This is what this war is doing. And she was pointing and putting, the finger in the open scar of that thing. And so when we speak about writing, Marcela was introducing for the first time a narrative that was contradicting the official narrative and was saying there are innocent people being killed or being disappearing or going through these gruesome acts of violence. And it is very necessary, politically very necessary, to describe in detail how this violence was being executed. And so when we think about a narrative that glorifies violence, I would say, let's stop and let's think, why should Marcela write in a lesser or more light way this narrative when she's trying to honor the suffering of the people that she saw firsthand? You know, I can go on many examples, but I will not. But the burden, carrying the burden, and we here, you and I, we work with words. We know that words matter. And so she was responsible. She felt responsible, not for the acts, but she was naming those acts for the first time. While the act of the state is saying, we haven't done these acts, the act of Marcela in particular is saying, this society is doing these things. So you carry the responsibility of naming, and that has a cost, that has an emotional burden. So my book is not organized chronologically. The first chapter is about a journalist who couldn't write about the things she saw. And she couldn't write not because the things she saw, the massacre, was horrible, but because she was shocked by the way other journalists came to report on that. It was a massacre that occurred in rural Colombia because of a guerrilla group. A guerrilla group put a bomb and many people died. And so she was shocked, and she says, she told me in our interview, I didn't have the tools to write about this. I didn't. So I begin this first act that the Cesare comments saying, it might be silence. It might be, you cannot handle, you cannot put that in words, either because you're too young, you're not prepared, whatever. Marcela will be that first moment. And then Daniela Rea and Sandra Rodriguez Nieto. Sandra Rodriguez Nieto is a seasoned reporter from Ciudad Juárez. And so she knows Ciudad Juárez by heart. I think that her narratives are more in the second act that the Cesare describes, and as well as Daniela Rea. That's how I kind of place these chapters in the book. And the last two is, well, one is an Argentine reporter who wrote about the trials of the human rights criminals in Argentina. And another one is also Patricia Nieto, but talking more in a very beautiful and even lyric way about the violence in a small town in Colombia. So I the flow of the book would follow that description, that initial description from Donna's session. And so I realized also that these reporters and these cronistas and these journalists were not talking about violence per se. In the book, I tend to talk about more this, how do you represent the suffering of others? And so if you approach this slightly different approach, will make the object of your study a different thing, because it's very difficult. It's very different to say how do we represent violence than saying, how do we represent the suffering of others? Because of course, violence is there, but what we want to see, it's not the violence, it's the effects of that violence, the short-term and the long-term effects of that violence. So if you're interested in doing this kind of research, think about, is it violence what you're interested in? Many times we're not. We're looking at the people who carry the burden of having survived or having gone through the experience of violence. So it is a very different approach to say how these journalists want to honor the suffering of the people they talk to, and how they want to make justice to these victims. And so I saw that approach also opened me another window, which was, how do I explain this relationship? How do I theoretically map this relationship between the journalists coming to, aftermath of a massacre? And it was during my conversations with Marcela Turati and Patricia Nieto, they both talk about their job as journalists as a job of listeners. And it was very shocking to me because both of them said, this is our real mandate as journalists who live in these countries, Colombia, Mexico. And so Adriana Caballero has this beautiful book called Inclinations, Critique of Rectitude. And she talks about ethics and a shared vulnerability as our ethical, as the real ethical proposal, or she proposes that the shared vulnerability is where ethics resides. And she contrasts this proposal to, and she reads the body. She reads the inclined body of the mother taking care of the kid. She doesn't want to make an essentialist argument about motherhood or that, but she says that posture, and she analyzes pictures, and she goes all the way back to the Renaissance. It is a beautiful book, but she talks about the body and the inclination, contrasting it to the Enlightenment figure of the autonomous upright man, which is our liberal and neoliberal idea of the ethical man. So in that posture, we see somebody who does not depend on anybody, whereas in the inclination, we see a posture of care. And for me, when these two journalists were talking about listening, you immediately think about two subjects. If you talk about listening, you don't have the idea of a single person. And for those of you who come from Latin American literature, you know that crónicas at the beginning of the century were read as the genre of the gaze, viewing, because the Flanner is the one who looks from the outside. And so since I was reading a lot about journalism and crónicas, I came across this quote from Martín Caparrós. And they all talk about how la mirada is a complex, gaze is a complex. It is not just seeing, it's more complex. But it goes back, for us to gaze, it's to be, you can be away from the reality you're gazing at or you're looking at. Whereas when you listen, you cannot be disengaged from the other person. And so this quote by Caparrós says that the gaze of the cronista is the gaze of the hunter. And I love that because it was such a contrast. The hunter, you can say the hunter is from afar looking at the prey. And when you listen to these journalists talking about, you listen. You have to listen to the other person. And then there is this beautiful article by Rinahat Guha, The Small Voices of History. And he has a quote that he says, you have to bend your body to listen to the other person. And it was such a beautiful, when you're doing research and you find your gems, that was like the gem, because that was exactly what I trying to articulate. The listening, that was the ethical proposal. And so I will come back to this idea, but I want to go into two things about Marcela Turati, and this is a chapter. So I understood all the complexities of writing about this. And I in this book, I did what I did in the former book. I went to the cities, I interviewed the journalists, I stayed with them, I shadowed them when I visited Marcela for the first time. It was March 2015. So this is few months after the Ayotzinapa events. Marcela was super engaged in reporting Ayotzinapa. She was traveling to Guerrero very often. At that point, also, there was this whole fuss because the Hay Festival was being organized in Veracruz. Veracruz at that time had a horrible governor who was killing journalists like popcorn. And so how the Hay Festival could be celebrated in a city where so many journalists were killed, so journalists were standing up, and she was very involved with that. So that sort of activism, Marcela didn't have at that time a prominent place in the Periodistas de a pie, but that was a network she coordinated, she founded with two other journalists to defend themselves from what was going on. And you can ask me this in the Q&A, I can go into telling you more stories. I just want to tell you how I found Marcela. What was she doing when I went to visit her? She was doing all sorts of things, having conversations with the people of human rights to see what happened in Ayotzinapa, how the journalists could help. She was very close to John Gibler. He wrote probably the best crónica on Ayotzinapa. It is a very important chronicle because his findings helped to reveal the truth. And so I asked Marcela, and this is something that I ask many journalists because they live in fear. And so I said, how is it that you feel fear? What is fear? And so Marcela was standing in her kitchen and she said, it's something that you feel here. It's a pain in the neck that you feel here, and it paralyzes you. And in telling you this, I still feel the chills because for them, this is something that they carry every day. How? Because they receive threats, and the threats are not that somebody calls and say, I'm going to kill you. Marcela's family, one of the members of her family was sitting in a coffee shop in Chihuahua, and somebody said, I heard that your Marcela is in trouble, and if she heard these gossips 2 or 3 times, she knows that that's a threat. That's how subtle and perverse the threats are. So I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that these journalists work with this pressure, and not just that, but many of their friends have been killed. So this is the situation in which they are working and writing the things we read. And so I went into detail of what was the most difficult part of her job. And from Marcela and especially from Sandra Rodriguez. As I said, Sandra Rodriguez is a seasoned journalist in Juarez. And Sandra, so imagine that for Sandra, reporting 20 years in the same city, she knows everybody. So when we talk about corruption or impunity, these, empty, big concepts, for Sandra is a face. Sandra knows exactly who turned around, who committed the crime, who did nothing, and she cannot write about this. And so imagine what it is to live and write and work with these heavy burdens of. And so I tried to understand that, what it meant what was the meaning of working with this? And Jonathan Shay has this book about, he's a psychiatrist from Harvard who worked with the Vietnam and he interviewed them for several years. And he came to realize that the worst trauma that they were carrying wasn't because of a specific traumatic event, but they were carrying these moral trauma. And he explains this moral trauma by going back to the Iliad. And he says, when Agamemnon didn't give Achilles the prize he was supposed to receive for winning his battle, he betrayed what was wrong. He betrayed what was right. Sorry, he betrayed, themis is the word in Greek. He betrayed the convention. If you have a soldier who's willing to give his life to fight a war, and what happened, you might have seen Ken Burns, the documentary on Vietnam, which is pretty impressive. But they were sent to the war, and the weapons they were given didn't work. That's as bad as it was. They were sent to kill civilians because there was no plan. They didn't know. So that sense of betrayal, you're willing to give your life for your country, but the people who are sending you to the war are not responding with responsibility. They are not caring for you. That sense of moral betrayal is what Jonathan Shay sees in his book. And this is what I saw in the journalists, a betrayal of what is right, because they know the people exactly who turned around, who didn't do anything, who remained silent. And the state is not doing anything. On the contrary, the state is killing those journalists who are telling what's going on. So that sense of moral betrayal, it is a huge burden. How do they process that? Shay speaks of two ways that is his process, and he speaks about the state of Berserk, or the Berserk state, sorry. And so, and that's the explanation to these stories we read about, you know, people coming from the war and having horrible stories of domestic violence. They have this state of perpetual arousal. And it has to do with their trauma. And you go nuts. Achilles went nuts when he killed Hector. He didn't respect the conventions of how you had to let the family, you know, bury your enemy, because he was crazy, he was nuts, he was angry. And there is another way of processing this moral, which is guilt. So that guilt that I saw when Marcela presented the book, she was carrying the weight of the words she wrote, because she felt responsible for all those horrible actions. But it wasn't her, but it was her, because it was her word. They were her words. So I saw Marcela for the last time before the book came out here in Austin. She came to a conference, and she was a Newman Fellow at Harvard at the time. And you're supposed to reflect in this, you know, fellowships about your work. And she told me I couldn't write a word. I was just processing. And I was finally overcoming my sense of being an imposter. And so I thought, what a harsh word, what a heavy word to talk about her work. And I said, Marcela, why? And then I understood. And I told you at the beginning of this talk that when I talked to Javier Valdez, I saw the dangers of representing narco, but also how they want to be recognized in the field of production. Marcela is a super recognized journalist. She has won several awards. She has won fellowships. She was at Harvard, but she got all these recognition by writing about the pain of other people at that expense. So she was carrying this guilt of having all this success by writing about the pain of others. And that was very difficult for her to process, very, very difficult. And so I realized that that is also something that these journalists, and I'm talking about Marcela, and so I kind of directed you to this very intimate way of looking at Marcela's effective response to her work. But I would like to finish with one story that I tell in the book, that is Marcela was interviewing the wife of one of the people killed in Ayotzinapa. This girl, Maritza, had received 2 checks from the state. She didn't know why. There was no official notice that they acknowledged the damage they made. Her husband was Cesar Mondragon, the one that the skin was taken off his face, was desollado. I don't know the word in English. I look it up and it didn't sound a word that I know, so I wouldn't use it, because sometimes our words are very not familiar to us, so I respect that. And so the girl didn't want, or the woman didn't want to be, she was afraid. She didn't want anybody to know where she was. She had a baby. And so they decided to meet in this car in one of the Ayotzinapa rallies, you know, in Zócalo, against the state because of the disappearance of the Ayotzinapa students. And there they are, these 2 women in the car hiding in the dark with all the you know, noise outside of people screaming and yelling and marching. And she was telling the story of how she met his wife, I mean, her husband, the kid they have, and how he disappeared. And I thought that it was a very strong image to talk about that thing that I mentioned before, which is this ethical component that really shows a shared vulnerability, because there it was, the victim of this horrible event, and the writer who had to put that in words to share with us. And so I probably should finish here. I talk a lot. I hope I was useful somehow, and I'm open to questions, and I'm very thankful for your attention.
Gabby, thank you very much. I want everybody just a round of applause, either virtual or real.
Thank you.
We have a lot of time for questions, and I imagine we all have a lot of them. I was scribbling down lots of things, but I want to open up the floor for people to just jump in, comments or queries.
Let me grab a pen here. Yeah.
You know, perhaps I can, I'll start us off a little because I'm finishing off an article on violence and affective regimes, psychopic regimes, and particularly about audiovisual media. And so this is one, you know, your talk is just really generative. But I'm wondering how you might sit the work of these reporters within that larger field of production, right? Because we have lots of people from Sayak Valencia, right? Irmgard, Emil Heinz, right? On one end, kind of saying any representation is a violation. Right?
Yeah.
And then you have Rivera Garza saying, no, there is this moment of condoler, right?
Exactly.
And it's based on vulnerability.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could perhaps illuminate us, right, about your idea of how this field works, right? And writing, right? Not necessarily verses, but I think it's often taken as verses, the audiovisual, right?
Yeah.
Or photography, right? Which captures a frozen moment. And what can that do other than make a spectacle?
Yeah.
Verses. So I'm wondering if you could, it's a very open-ended question, but kind of elaborate into those debates within the kind of Mexican intellectual circles.
Yes. You know, I would say that I'm shy to intervene in these in these debates. I have my views, and my views are very attached to what I saw in my research. So my response might be theoretical, but at the same time, it is something that comes after reflections, long reflections, after dialogues with these journalists. So I understand that if you take representations as a broad field and say every representation is a violation or is a violence, but what I'm trying to see is the middle person there. Representations don't come out of the blue. Representations come out of specific things that are not just the relationship between, let's say, the journalist and, for the sake of, I mean, I don't like the word, but and the victim. It is not just that. Journalists have specific things that they have to do. And I didn't talk about it in the talk because it would have been too long, but they have a limited time. They are given 2 days to go and cover the massacre over there and come back with the pictures that will show everybody. When they want to tell a longer story about that, it's on them. Many of the journalists are freelance. And that means, so let me tell you a story, for example. Laura Castellanos wrote about a massacre in, I forgot the name of the town, Tlaltaca. I forgot the name of the town, but it was in the news, it was a crossfire. And so she works freelance for a newspaper. That means that the newspaper is, she's a steady freelance for this newspaper. The newspaper will pay her, let her do the job and come back. So when she comes back, she tells the story that it wasn't actually a crossfire, that after her research, she found out that for the directions of the, the holes in the wall, blah, 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 she proved that it was the army who came and committed the massacre. The newspaper decided not to publish it because it was against their economic interests at that time. So she put all these people who interview with her in danger already. If she doesn't put the story out, those people are even in more danger. So she has to buy back the story from the newspaper. She doesn't have the money. So she goes to Artículo 19, which is a network of journalists, and they help her. And so she didn't have that outlet. She had to go to alternative outlets. So the story came out with Aristegui and Proceso. So when you look at these discussions about every violence is an act of violence, and we translate those things into the actual burdens that the people doing their job have to go through, I just don't buy those arguments. I want substance to those arguments, because if Laura Castellanos didn't publish that story, the victims that were brave enough to say, they actually came and killed us, will be dead now. So there is an ethical component in these things that for me, it's not a theoretical abstract thing. It has to do with very, very specific and very grounded situations. And so I don't have a general, I don't have a whole answer to your questions, but my approach is, let's try to see in detail the specific context of this narrative. And I would include that the audiovisual as well. Because when you see the ethical challenges, not just the ethical challenges, but the ethical challenges that are related to the material conditions of production for many of these stories, then you see another reality. And because I do think that there is a kind of art or journalism that is committed to show the pain of others. And if that's the commitment, why should I not get all the details and have a hygienized version of an awful event because it's gruesome? Well, that's how the victims live. And at some point, the artist or the journalist will have to, I would say that it's a difference because art could, go into other figures of speech and represent, but in journalism, they are just giving us that. And I don't think that my answer could apply to everybody, but I would say that this is the way I want to understand the narratives in a specific context. And that would give me, ground to say yes or no, or.
Thank you, Gabi. Who's next? I'm looking for virtual digital hands raised, but I don't see anybody yet. But if I'm overlooking somebody, feel free to unmute.
I can make one question.
Yeah.
So also building up on this comment of representation of violence, I was interested when you talked about listening, right? Because also when we talk about listening, we assume that there is someone willing to say something, right? Someone willing to share their story. And that I understand this ethical element that you were saying, right? We need to tell these stories of violence, these stories of people who suffered some type of violence, and they want to tell this story as well. So my question is, how do you see this component of listening, if you see translated in the form and the content of these narratives? It's just what is said, or is how these writers or artists are saying, or journalists are saying?
Thank you. And that is the challenge, right? How do you read? And this is going back to something that I think that is what the journalists ask themselves when they go to these workshops and they struggle to represent what I said, Maria's story. How do I honor Maria's story? Because the challenge the risk is to reproduce all the stereotypes we have about, youth consuming drugs and selling drugs in the shantytown, or women getting pregnant very early in shantytowns, which, by the way, it's true. But when you see that it's not women but Maria, or it's not the youth but Juan, then how do you honor that story? How do you make of that story something that shows? And I think that your question is exactly what we try to read in these narratives. Who's making it? So if you read a book like Marcela's, and I go to her because that's the presentation, it is a book that it's filled with very physical details about how the bodies were found, how the people were coming from the other states to see if those bodies could be the son or the daughter that they lost years ago. And so how we balance that gruesome story with the act of listening. And in that tension, I would say it again, it is not an easy answer, but for me, what enlightened me was understanding the place from where Marcela was writing, and understanding that at that particular time in history, in the Mexican context, probably a book like this was necessary. But it will not apply to all the stories in the same way. Let me think. Okay, so in the same book, you have Patricia Nieto writes about a town in Colombia where people rescue the bodies they find in the riverbank, and there are bodies that are coming down the river, killed by any armed group, guerrilla, paramilitary, and so they rescue them, and the municipality has money to. And I have a picture of this. I should I'm going to show you. They pay so I don't know if you see. It's the cemetery, and so people rescue the dead bodies and bury them and paint their tombs with these flashy colors, and they give them a name. They give them a name and ask for rewards in the future. So I rescue you from what's the name of the place between heaven and earth? In Purgatorio. From the Purgatorio, I don't know how to say purgatory, because you're a wandering soul and you need to rest. I give you that, and I offer you this. Please give me, something. And the way she writes this, it is a poetic, lyrical way. And she makes justice to the fact without, because we can say, oh, these superstitious people, but she does it in such a beautiful way that she makes justice to this, at the same time rescuing the sense of solidarity with the dead bodies, because deep down themselves, they see them as those possible corpses. And so there you go. You don't have to have a gruesome explanation of what you're telling, because what you're saying is another. And so I do think that form always is part of this. And I do think that we have to honor that with all discussion, no? But they come together, form and content. But this is a great example to see how, despite the fact that she's telling a crude and sad story, it's beautifully written, and the characters that appear are each of us has a halo of the person who cleans the corpses, the forensic doctor, the person who brings the body, who cleans the body, and the person who takes care of the in el cementerio, the guy who takes care of the cemetery. Each of them has a very special place in the story, and I do think that it's, well, it also honors that story, and it's a very different one from the one that Marcela is telling us.
Thanks, Gabi. Other questions?
Okay, if they don't have, I could have one. What happens when there are confronting people with different sufferings, and you have to tell a story, and you do not know which side to decide and how you're gonna put together these confronting stories?
That is so difficult, and because one thing is that think about journalism having this doxa in the Bourdieuian sense of being objective, right? It continues to operate in the heads of many young students of journalism. And so there is a difference between being objective and being, balanced. And so balance in the sense of the word is a slip in my head, but trying to see from both perspectives. I honestly think that the Mexican conflict is a conflict that presents those challenges, because you have this reality. Many young men from the South have few options to make it in Mexico. I'm talking about, I'm not making this up. Probably it was even Marcela's book, but many others too, that, coming from Chiapas, if you're young, there are not many ways to make it. So one choice is to go up north and migrate. And the other choice will be join the narcos. And probably the other choice is join the army. So you already have a mix of, you have a person who really doesn't have any opportunity in society, and the choices this person has, all of them have dead ends. So how you tell the story if these persons end up being in the army and being responsible for horrible things, or how you tell the story of this person if he ends up being in the narco, working for the narcos. And it's even more complex because we know that in trafficking, in the human trafficking, we don't know how many of the disappeared people are actually dead and how many end up working for the narcos. So how do you tell these stories? I think that Marcela does that in the book, because if you read all the chapters, she will switch perspectives. As in a novel, in a novel, when you tell the event from the perspective of one character, and then you tell the event from the perspective of another character, and so on. And so I think that she goes around, and at some point, what she says is the story of Mexico is the ni trabajo, ni educación, ni trabajo. And so at some point, she gives us numbers of how many young people are killed in Mexico. And so I don't think that it's an easy thing to write about, not at all. But in all of our countries, we see that inequality is constantly facing us to this question that you're asking. Because how these phenomena begin is because people don't have choices. And the fact that young people are not getting any choice does not redeem them from, I'm not saying that. Remember when the boom of the sicaresca, one of the forms of narrating these sicarios was, oh, he was poor, he didn't have opportunities, blah, blah, blah. Sandra Rodriguez Nieto, in her book, tells the story of a guy who killed the parents and the sister and put them a bomb, and burned them. The guy was a psychopath. But the interesting thing in the book is that by telling the story of a psychopath, she tells the reaction of the society. Because you tend to think, oh, the guy was a narco because he comes from no opportunity, blah, blah, blah. And this guy was Juarez middle class, so a middle class, not like here, Juarez standards middle class, but he had a family, he went to school, he had all these opportunities. But when he killed as a psychopath, what he did was reproducing the ways and the repertoires of killing that surrounded him. And I don't know why I went there. I'm going out of your question, but what I'm saying, it's very hard to put those two things in perspective. But I do think that Sandra Rodriguez, for example, by telling us this exceptional story, is also telling us a lot about these nuances in Juarez.
Yeah, definitely. When you were talking before, and when you were just now narrating this story, I have in mind the case of Bourdieu, Gavilan, and Agüero, and the different moments that they had, having in mind also the quote that you read.
Yeah.
At 1,
exactly.
at 2, at 3,
exactly.
and all the moments that they had to discuss what was being a senderista, a kid senderista, and then a military, and then an anthropologist, and then being
exactly
the son of a senderista, understanding what was going on and not being able to forgive. And so, but then I saw another instance here in the States, I think it was in Berkeley, when they were talking together, and it was so different from the first moment when each presented their own books in Peru. So I think it's hard to map who the other is in different situations, because the other has many layers.
Exactly.
And so how you decide who's suffering the most, and how do you tell who is that person, and not being betrayed by not being given the opportunity to be listened.
I think that, when you say who's suffering the most, I think that the question shouldn't be who's suffering the most, but understand the suffering in that particular moment, right? Again, my mantra is always contextualize, 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 contextualize to the very end, because that prevents you from making general assumptions. I can say that I respect a lot the people who's doing this job, because all these questions that for us are more in a theoretical realm, for them are very concrete questions when it comes to writing. And that, when you see that, it makes you humble, because we tend as cultural critics to be, to give these statements that are probably brilliant, and we quote all these people, and it's not like that. It's not like that. And I have to confess, I get bored with some works that are filled with these big statements, probably because I saw the things and I said, I don't want to read this. I'd rather read the journalists. Not all of them. I mean, they're, as in any field of production, they're good, great journalists and committed journalists, and there are others. But yeah, the context is what will give you guys contextualize, will give you the tools to better understand that object of study, I think.
Thank you, Gabi. We're at time right now, but if there's another question, if we could impose on Gabi, just one more, if there is one. Okay. Well, thank you so very much for this very interesting talk. Lots of really powerful ideas, right? And suggestions on how to approach research, right? From kind of different ways, I think, than often we do as cultural critics. So can everybody join me in a round of applause? Virtual or real?
Thank you. I'm honored, and thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. Thanks for taking us up on our invitation.
Well,
and thanks everyone for coming.
Bye.
So much. Hablamos ahora entonces.
Sí.
Ana, te envío después el link para la grabación cuando esté listo.
Perfecto. Muchísimas gracias. Muchísimas gracias a todos y seguimos entonces.
Gracias.
Chao.
Gabi, un enorme gusto verte otra vez.
Estaba poniendo, hola Michelle, claro que me acuerdo de ti, qué gusto de verte.
Nos vemos
Qué
pronto,
chévere.
papá.
Un besito, chao.
Chao.
Chao, muchas gracias. Chao, Anita.
Hablamos. Chao,
Gracias,
chao.
Laura. Un placer. Pedro, un placer. Chao.